It's a very good afternoon, because at long last, I can announce a ceasefire and a hostage deal has been reached between Israel and Hamas.
Qatari and Hamas negotiators say they have reached a ceasefire deal to halt fighting in Gaza, seeking to end the 15-month war that has overtaken the Middle East. But while Israel says they're close, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the final details are being sorted out. As the agreement stands right now, the three-phase deal would begin with the release of 33 Israeli hostages in exchange for hundreds of Palestinian women and children being held in Israel. Israel believes most hostages will be freed alive. If the deal goes into effect, it would cap off months of negotiations between Egyptian and Qatari mediators. Netanyahu's office says the details will hopefully be worked out by Wednesday night. After that, the plan would need to be approved by the Israeli Security Cabinet. Israeli troops invaded the Gaza Strip after the October 7th attacks that resulted in the deaths of over 1,100 people. 250 were taken hostage. Since then, Israeli forces have killed over 46,000 Palestinians in Gaza and have wounded over 109,000. President Biden announced Tuesday an executive order to remove Cuba from the official list of state sponsors of terrorism. The move comes less than a week before President-elect Trump takes office. Plus, Puerto Rico pleads for help from President-elect Trump after Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro made public threats to liberate the U.S. territory using Brazilian troops. Joining me now is The Hill's staff writer, Rafael Bernal. Wow, lots going on here. This deal between the Biden administration and Cuba was brokered by the Catholic Church in return for being taken off this list of state sponsors of terror. The Cuban government agreed to release more than 550 political prisoners. Florida Democrats are furious over this announcement. Surely it's going to be reversed by the incoming Trump administration. You can tell me if I'm wrong there, but the Trump administration implemented these sanctions during the end of his first term. What's the point of Biden taking this action now?
Well, it's mirror image to what Trump did to Biden on his way out in 2021. Cuba had not been on this list of state sponsors of terrorism, in part because there's very little evidence that Cuba has actually sponsored terrorism the way like Iran has, or North Korea, Russia. And in part because it's economically really problematic for the island, and it spurs out migration. So Trump left Biden with this hot potato. You can either look like you're a communist sympathizer, essentially, by taking Cuba off this list that he himself had not put Cuba on that list till the very last week of his administration, or you can keep Cuba on the list, their economy tanks, you get more Cuban migration, and you deal with that, and then I attack you for that. So Biden just returns the favor, mirror image. It does seem a little bit like more political gamesmanship than actual policymaking.
So now does Trump have a hot potato?
He does, because he doesn't want to reignite Cuban migration. Right now it's pretty controlled, but at the same time it would be easier for him to go after Cuba. He doesn't really lose anything by taking a harder line on Cuba, especially because his supporters in Florida basically are clamoring for him to do that.
I want to ask you about this letter sent by the governor of Puerto Rico to Trump this week asking for help after Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro said liberty of Puerto Rico is pending and it will be achieved with Brazilian troops. Puerto Rico, of course, a U.S. territory. I don't think anyone is taking Maduro's threats seriously, especially with Brazilian troops. But after elections last year in Venezuela, it seemed like there was some hope for change in the country. Are you surprised that Maduro has been able to stay in power up until now? And what do you think the incoming Trump administration means for Venezuela?
It's not surprising at all. Maduro has control over the actual levers of real power in the country, and that's the military, and that's whatever oil exports that Venezuela can still conduct, and allegedly, and very credibly, it is illicit gold mining and illicit drug exports, mostly to Europe, allegedly run, very credibly again, run through the military. So Maduro wasn't going anywhere. The Biden administration's attempt to negotiate a clean election with him was, some say, naive. Some say the only card that was available to the United States for a possibility of a clean election. Absolutely nobody, including the people in the Biden administration who negotiated this, were surprised that Maduro then turned around and basically forged the election results and named himself president again.
What happens under the Trump administration, which includes some hardliners on Venezuela, Marco Rubio among them?
There aren't many good options, and I think Venezuela watchers have had this in mind for a long time. I think that's part of what motivated the Biden administration to try the one thing that was available. Of course, you won't see many new licenses, any new licenses for oil exports from Venezuela. You'll see sort of a harder rhetorical line, but there's not much that can be done when Maduro subsists because of his allies that are U.S. geopolitical foes like Iran and Russia, and because of his alleged sales of cocaine to Europe. The United States doesn't have much to do to stop that at this time.
We're on the eve here of the Trump administration 2.0. He's promising aggressive action to deport undocumented immigrants. K through 12 schools are taking some steps in preparation for this. What are they doing?
Well, sadly, this is one of the things that K-12 schools, public schools in the United States, especially throughout the Southwest, have known how to do for decades. Schools in California, as far back as the 80s and probably the 70s, knew that when raids were coming, knew how to treat families who could be susceptible to raids. They're preparing, basically, the one thing they can do to prepare is tell families what to expect, as much as they can possibly know, and prepare to have, at times, kids whose parents have been deported. And it is a very difficult process for schools because they're not, obviously, an elementary school principal doesn't necessarily have to be an immigration policy expert, but it's another ball that the schools have to juggle with a potential family crises spurred on by mass deportation.
And traditionally, schools and places of worship have been places where undocumented immigrants have turned to, avoid being gathered up by ICE officials. Is that something that could change under the next Trump administration?
It's a policy. It's not in there by law. So yes, and ICE can change their policies on what places they target. They could potentially target places of worship, education. They have chosen not to because most administrations in the past have decided that it's really not worth the social cost.
Do you expect blue states to continue to try to put up roadblocks to, in their eyes, as they would see it, protect undocumented immigrants in their states? And what more could they do?
Some, and mostly to the extent that each state is blue on the topic of immigration. So you can expect very different actions in California than you would in Arizona, for instance. It really, and the other thing it'll depend on is really how much undocumented immigrants contribute to a particular state's economy. So California can't afford to lose its produce workforce. Pennsylvania probably can't afford to lose its dairy workforce. So you'll see different levels of protection. Some states will do it more through negotiations with the incoming Trump administration. Some states may do it through lawsuits, and some states may do it through policing policies and lack of cooperation with ICE, each one of those with different consequences.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Rafael Bernal, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Ukraine has carried out the most massive attack on Russia since the start of the war, according to officials in Kyiv. Forces struck several targets deep in Russia on Tuesday using U.S. and UK-made missiles and drones. The strike was a painful blow to Russia, according to Ukraine's SBU intelligence agency. Russia's military has vowed to retaliate against Ukraine after the strikes, who says they shot down some of the missiles. President-elect Donald Trump has said he is making ending the war in Ukraine a top priority. Trump plans to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin soon after he starts his second term. Capital One is being sued by a U.S. watchdog group over actions the bank took that they say were misleading and cheated customers. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is alleging Capital One deceived customers about its incentives for high-interest savings accounts. They say the bank cheated customers out of $2 billion in lost interest payments. The complaint names Capital One's 360 savings accounts, which boasts providing one of the nation's highest interest rates. The group says Capital One froze its rates at a low amount for several years, even as interest rates rose nationally. The complaint comes less than 1 week until President-elect Trump is set to take office. Some analysts have questioned whether the litigation will survive his new administration, with the possibility that it may be easier to settle the complaint. Inflation gained traction in December, despite the U.S. economy closing the year out showing unexpected signs of strength. 2024 closed out with inflation sitting at 2.9%, according to new data released by the Labor Department. The Consumer Price Index rose 0.4%, meeting previous expectations from economists. The new figures come as the Fed faces growing concerns about the potential economic impacts of President-elect Trump's proposed tariffs and immigration agenda. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petromo. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hills YouTube channel. Come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.